USS Enterprise CV-6. USS Enterprise CV-6 was a Yorktown-class carrier built for the United States Navy during the 1930s. She was the seventh U.S. Navy vessel of that name. Colloquially called the Big E, she was the sixth aircraft carrier of the United States Navy. Launched in 1936, she was one of only three American carriers commissioned before World War II to survive the war, the others being Saratoga and Ranger. She participated in more major actions of the war against Japan than any other United States ship. These actions included the attack on Pearl Harbor. 18 Douglas SBD Dauntless dive bombers of her air group arrived over the harbor. During the attack, 7 were shot down with 8 airmen killed and 2 wounded, making her the only American aircraft carrier with men at Pearl Harbor during the attack and the first to sustain casualties during the Pacific War. The Battle of Midway. Enterprise earned 20 battle stars, the most for any U.S. warship in World War II, and was the most decorated U.S. ship of World War II. She was also the first American ship to sink a full-sized enemy warship after the Pacific War had been declared, when her aircraft sank the Japanese submarine -70 on 10 December 1941. On 3 occasions during the war, the Japanese announced that she had been sunk in battle, inspiring her nickname the Gray Ghost. By the end of the war, her planes and guns had downed 911 enemy planes, sunk 71 ships, and damaged or destroyed 192 more. Construction and commissioning. The sixth carrier built for the United States Navy and the second of the Yorktown class, Enterprise was launched on 3 October 1936 at Newport News Shipbuilding, sponsored by Lully Swanson, wife of Secretary of the Navy Claude A. Swanson, and commissioned on 12 May 1938 with Captain Newton H. White, Jr. in command. Enterprise sailed south on a shakedown cruise which took her to Rio de Janeiro. Captain Charles A. Pownall relieved White on 21 December. After her return, she operated along the East Coast and in the Caribbean until April 1939, when she was ordered to duty in the Pacific. Service history. Enterprise was one of 14 ships to receive the early RCACXAM-1 radar. Captain George D. Murray assumed command of the carrier on 21 March 1941. Based first at San Diego, where she was used in the filming of Dive Bomber, starring Errol Flynn and Fred McMurray, and then at Pearl Harbor on the Hawaiian island of Oahu after President Roosevelt ordered the fleet to be forward-based. The carrier and her air group trained intensively and transported aircraft to American island bases in the Pacific. Enterprise and the other ships of Task Force 8 TF-8 departed Pearl Harbor on 28 November 1941 to deliver Marine Fighter Squadron. She was scheduled to return to Hawaii on 6 December 1941, but was delayed by the weather, and she was still at sea about 215 nautical miles 398 km west of Oahu at dawn on 7 December 1941. World War II, Min-2. Pearl Harbor. Enterprise launched 18 of her SBD the CAG aircraft, 13 aircraft from Scouting Squadron 6B-6 and 4 aircraft from Bombing Squadron 6B-6 at dawn on 7 December to scout an arc extending from the northeast to southeast of the ship, and to land at Ford Island at Pearl Harbor after completing their search routes. As these aircraft arrived in pairs over Pearl Harbor, they were caught between attacking Japanese aircraft and defensive anti-aircraft fire from the ships and shore installations below. 7 SBD were shot down, either from enemy action or friendly fire, with the loss of 8 airmen killed and 2 wounded. Enterprise received radio messages from Pearl Harbor reporting that the base was under attack, and she was later directed to launch an airstrike based on an inaccurate report of a Japanese carrier southwest of her location. The strike was launched around 17:00, consisting of 6 Grumman F-4F Wildcat fighters of Fighting Squadron 6V-F-6, 18 Douglas TBD Devastator torpedo bombers of Torpedo Squadron 6V-T-6, and 6 SPD of VB-6. Unable to locate any targets, the torpedo and dive bombers returned to Enterprise, but the 6 fighters were directed to divert to Hickam Field on Oahu. Although word of the plane's expected arrival had been broadcast to all ships and anti-aircraft units in the area, the appearance of the Wildcats in the night sky over Oahu triggered panic firing, which shot down 3 of them, killing their pilots, while a 4th aircraft ran out of fuel, forcing the pilot to bail out. Enterprise pulled into Pearl Harbor for fuel and supplies on the evening of 8 December. Vice Admiral William Halsey, Jr., commander of Carrier Division 2, ordered every able-bodied man on board to help rearm and refuel Enterprise. This process normally took 24 hours to complete, but was completed this time within 7 hours. She and the other ships of TF-8 sailed early the next morning to patrol against possible additional attacks on the Hawaiian Islands. Although the group encountered no Japanese surface ships, Enterprise aircraft sank Japanese submarine IMINUS-70 at 23:45 and 155:35 on 10 December 1941. During the last 2 weeks of December 1941, Enterprise and her escorts steamed west of Hawaii to cover the islands, while 2 other carrier groups made a belated attempt to relieve Wake Island. After a brief layover at Pearl Harbor, Enterprise and her group sailed on 11 January 1942, protecting convoys reinforcing Samoa. On 16 January 1942, a TBD of VT-6, piloted by Chief Aviation Machinist's Mate and enlisted Naval Aviation pilot Harold F. Dixon, got lost on patrol, ran out of fuel, and ditched. Dixon and his 2 crewmates, Bombardier Anthony J. Pastula and gunner Gene Aldrich, survived for 34 days in a small rubber raft after their food and water were washed overboard before drifting ashore on the atoll of Puka Puka, where the natives fed them and notified Allied authorities. The 3 men were then picked up by USS Swan. Dixon was awarded the Navy Cross for extraordinary heroism, exceptional determination, resourcefulness, skilled seamanship, excellent judgment, and highest quality of leadership. On 1 February 1942, Enterprise's Task Force 8 raided Kwajalein, Watch, and Malalap in the Marshall Islands, sinking 3 Japanese. Enterprise received only minor damage in the Japanese counterattack as TF-8 retired to Pearl Harbor. The next month, Enterprise, now part of Task Force 16, swept the Central Pacific, attacking enemy installations on Wake and Marcus Islands. Doolittle Raid, April 1942. After minor alterations and repairs at Pearl Harbor, Enterprise and TF-16 departed on 8 April 1942 to rendezvous with her sister ship Hornet and sailed west, escorting Hornet on the mission to launch 16 Army B-25 Mitchells in the Doolittle raid on Tokyo. While fighters from Enterprise flew combat air patrol, the B-25s launched on 18 April and flew undetected the remaining 600 miles 1,000 km to the target. The task force, its presence known to the enemy after a Japanese picket boat radioed a warning, reversed course and returned to Pearl Harbor on 25 April. Battle of Midway, June 1942. 5 days later, Enterprise sorted toward the South Pacific to reinforce U.S. carriers operating in the Coral Sea. However, the Battle of the Coral Sea was over before Enterprise arrived. With Hornet, she performed a feint towards Nauru and Banaba Ocean Islands, which caused the Japanese. On 28 May, Enterprise departed Pearl Harbor as Rear Admiral Raymond A. Spruancy's flagship, with orders to hold Midway and inflict maximum damage on the enemy by strong attrition tactics. With Enterprise in TF-16 were Hornet, 6 cruisers, 10 destroyers, and 4 oilers. On 30 May, Task Force 17 TF-17, with Rear Admiral Frank J. Fletcher in Yorktown, left Pearl with 2 cruisers and 6 destroyers and rendezvoused with TF-16. As senior officer present, Rear Admiral Fletcher became officer in tactical command. Vice Admiral Halsey, the usual commander of TF-16 and senior to both Fletcher and Spruance, was medically ordered to remain in a naval hospital at Pearl Harbor due to stress-induced severe weight loss and severe psoriasis. Each side launched air attacks during the day in a decisive battle. Though the forces were in contact until 7 June, by 10:45 m on 4 June the outcome had been decided. 3 Japanese carriers were burning, and it was only a matter of time until a fourth was caught and knocked out. The Battle of Midway began on the morning of 4 June 1942, when 4 Japanese carriers, unaware of the presence of U.S. naval forces, launched attacks on Midway Island. Shortly after the first bomb fell on Midway, the first wave of planes 4B-26B Marauders, 6 TBF-1 Avengers, 11 SB2U-3s, 16 SBD and 15 B-17s from Midway Island attacked unsuccessfully. Several more groups attacked, again failing to damage their targets. Planes from the U.S. carriers attacked next. Enterprise torpedo bombers attacked first, scoring no hits and suffering heavy losses. Soon after, Enterprise dive bombers attacked and disabled the Japanese carriers Kaga and Akagi, leaving them ablaze, while Yorktown aircraft also bombed the Japanese aircraft carrier Soryu, leaving her burning and dead in the water. Within an hour, the remaining Japanese carrier Huryu launched air strikes that crippled Yorktown with 3 bombs and 2 torpedoes striking home during 2 separate attacks. In late afternoon, a mixed squadron of Enterprise and Yorktown bombers, flying from Enterprise, disabled Huryu, leaving her burning. The following day, Enterprise dive bombers alone sank cruiser Makuma, while Yorktown and Hammond were the only American ships sunk. TF-16 and TF-17 lost a total of 113 planes, 61 of them in combat. Japanese losses were much higher: 4 carriers all scuttled, 1 cruiser, and 272 carrier aircraft with many of their highly experienced air crews. Despite losses to her aircraft squadrons, Enterprise came through undamaged and returned to Pearl Harbor on 13 June 1942. South Pacific. Captain Arthur C. Davis relieved Murray on 30 June 1942. After a month of rest and overhaul, Enterprise sailed on 15 July 1942 for the South Pacific, where she joined TF-61 to support the amphibious landings in the Solomon Islands on 8 August. For the next 2 weeks, the carrier and her planes guarded seaborne communication lines southwest of the Solomons. On 24 August, a strong Japanese force was discovered some 200 miles 300 km north of Guadalcanal, and TF-61 sent planes to the attack. In the ensuing Battle of the Eastern Solomons, the light carrier Ujo was sunk, and the Japanese troops intended for Guadalcanal were forced back. Enterprise suffered most heavily of the American ships. 3 direct bomb hits and 4 near misses killed 74, wounded 95, and inflicted serious damage on the carrier. Quick, hard work by damage control parties patched her up so that she was able to return to Hawaii under her own power. Repaired at Pearl Harbor from 10 September 16 October 1942, Enterprise embarked Air Group 10 in early October. This was the first time that the Grim Reapers of VF-10 deployed from Enterprise under Commanding Officer James H. She departed once more for the South Pacific, where with Hornet she formed TF-61, although Captain Osborne Hardison relieved Davis on 21 October. 5 days later, Enterprise scout planes located a Japanese carrier force, and the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands was underway. Enterprise aircraft struck carriers and cruisers during the struggle, while the ship herself underwent intensive attack. Hit twice by bombs, Enterprise lost 44 men and had 75 wounded. Despite serious damage, she continued in action and took on board a large number of planes and crewmen from Hornet when that carrier was sunk. Though the American losses of a carrier and a destroyer were more severe than the Japanese loss of 1 light cruiser, The battle gained time to reinforce Guadalcanal against the next enemy onslaught, and nearby Henderson Field was therefore secure from the Japanese bombardment. The loss of Hornet meant Enterprise was now the only functioning, albeit damaged, U.S. carrier in the Pacific theater. On one of the decks, the crew posted a sign, Enterprise vs. Japan. Enterprise reached Noumea, New Caledonia on 30 October for repairs, but a new Japanese thrust at the Solomons demanded her presence, and she sailed on 11 November, with repair crews from Vestal still working on board. Part of the repair crew were 75 Seabees from Company B of the 3rd Construction Battalion. This was due to a shortage of fleet repair resources. Underway with orders to engage the enemy, the Seabees focused on effecting repairs even during the forthcoming battle. The work was under the round-the-clock supervision of Enterprise's Damage Control Officer Lieutenant CMDR Herschel Albert Smith. The commanding officer of Enterprise, Captain Osborne Bennett Ozzie B. Obby Hardison, notified the Navy Department that the emergency repairs accomplished by this skillful, well-trained, and enthusiastically energetic force have placed this vessel in condition for further action against the enemy. This remarkable job later won the praise of Vice Admiral William Halsey, Jr., Commander South Pacific Area and the South Pacific Force, who sent a dispatch to the OIC of the CB detachment stating, "Your commander wishes to express to you and the men of the construction battalion serving under you his appreciation for the services rendered by you in effecting emergency." When the naval Battle of Guadalcanal ended on 15 November 1942, Enterprise had shared in sinking 16 ships and damaging 8 more. The carrier returned to Noumea on 16 November to complete her repairs. Sailing again on 4 December, Enterprise trained out of Espiritu Santo, New Hebrides, until 28 January 1943, when she departed for the Solomons area. On 30 January, her fighters flew combat air patrol for a cruiser-destroyer group during the Battle of Renel Island. Despite the destruction of most of the attacking Japanese bombers by Enterprise planes, the heavy cruiser Chicago was sunk by aerial torpedoes. Detached after the battle, the carrier arrived at Espiritu Santo on 1 February, and for the next 3 months operated out of that base, covering U.S. surface forces up to the Solomons. Captain Samuel Ginder assumed command of the ship on 16 April. Enterprise then steamed to Pearl Harbor where, on 27 May 1943, Admiral Chester Nimitz presented the ship with the first Presidential Unit Citation awarded to an aircraft carrier. In the summer of 1943, over the course of several months, Enterprise received an extensive refit, which included, among other upgrades, new anti-aircraft weapons and an anti-torpedo blister that significantly improved her underwater protection. This mid-war refit is where she would receive her 2 iconic 6 on her flight decks. Return to duty. Captain Matthias Gardner relieved Ginder on 7 November. Back at Pearl Harbor on 6 November, Enterprise left 4 days later to provide close air support to the 27th Infantry Division landing on Makin Atoll during the Battle of Makin from 1921 November 1943. On the night of 26 November, Enterprise introduced carrier-based night fighters to the Pacific when a 3-plane team from the ship broke up a large group of land-based bombers attacking TG-50.2. 2 of the 3 planes returned to the ship, with LCDR Edward Butch O'Hare the only casualty. After a heavy strike by aircraft of TF-50 against Kwajalein on 4 December, Enterprise returned to Pearl Harbor 5 days later. The carrier's next operation was with the Fast Carrier Task Force in softening up the Marshall Islands and supporting the landings on Kwajalein from 29 January–3 February 1944. Then Enterprise sailed, still with TF-58, to strike the Japanese naval base at Truk Lagoon in the Caroline Islands on 17 February. Again, Enterprise made aviation history when she launched the first night radar bombing attack from a U.S. carrier. The 12 torpedo bombers in this strike achieved excellent results, accounting for nearly one-third of the 200,000 tons of shipping destroyed by aircraft. Detached from TF-58 with escorts, Enterprise launched raids on Jaluit Atoll on 20 February, then steamed to Majuro and Espiritu Santo. Sailing on 15 March in TG-36.1, she provided air cover and close support for the landings on Emrao Island 1925 March. The carrier rejoined TF-58 on 26 March and for the next 12 days joined in a series of strikes against the islands of Yap, Ulithi, Wolai, and Palau. After a week's rest and replenishment at Majuro, Enterprise sailed on 14 April to support landings in the Hollandia currently known as Jayapura area of New Guinea, and then hit truck again from 29-30 April. On 6 June 1944, she and her companions of TG-58.3 sorted from Majuro to join the rest of TF-58 in attacking the Marianas Islands. Striking Saipan Rota and Guam from 11-14 June, Enterprise pilots gave direct support to the landings on Saipan on 15 June and covered the troops ashore for the next 2 days. Aware of a major Japanese attempt to break up the invasion of Saipan, Admiral Spruance, now Commander 5th Fleet, positioned TF-58 to meet the threat. Battle of the Philippine Sea. On 19 June 1944, Enterprise was one of 4 carriers of Task Group 58.3 under the command of Rear Admiral John W. Reeves during the largest carrier aircraft battle in history, the Battle of the Philippine Sea. For over 8 hours, airmen of the United States and Imperial Japanese navies fought in the skies over TF-58 and the Marianas. Over the course of 2 days, a total of 6 American ships were damaged, and 130 planes, and a total of 76 pilots and aircrew were lost. In sharp contrast, American carrier aircraft, with a major assist from U.S. submarines, sank 3 Japanese carriers Hyo, Shikaku, and Teiho and destroyed 426 carrier aircraft, losses from which Japanese naval aviation would never recover. Enterprise participated both in the defense of the fleet and in the subsequent early evening strike against the Japanese task forces. During the chaotic after-dark recovery of the airstrike, a fighter and a bomber came aboard simultaneously, but fortunately did not cause an accident. A planned midnight strike against the Japanese fleet by night-flying Enterprise pilots was cancelled because of the recovery and rescue operations required after the dusk attack. After the battle, Enterprise and her task group continued to provide air support for the invasion of Saipan through 5 July. She then sailed for Pearl Harbor and a month of rest and overhaul, during which she was painted in Measure 33/4 Abdazzle camouflage. During this time, Gardner was replaced by Commander Thomas Hamilton on 10 July before he was relieved in his turn by Captain Cato Glover on 29 July. Back in action on 24 August, the carrier sailed with TF-38 in that force's aerial assault on the Volcano and Bonin Islands from 31 August to September, and Yap, Ulithi, and the Palaus from 6-8 September. Battle of Leyte Gulf, 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 Leyte Gulf. Sailing on 24 December for the Philippines, Enterprise carried an air group specially trained in night carrier operations. As the only carrier capable of night operations, she left Oahu with her hull code changed from CV to CVN, the N representing night. She joined TG-38.5 and swept the waters north of Luzon and of the South China Sea during January 1945, striking shore targets and shipping from Formosa to Indochina, including an attack on Macau. After a brief visit to Ulithi, Enterprise joined TG-58.5 on 10 February 1945 and provided day and night combat air patrol for TF-58 as it struck Tokyo on 16-17 February. Iwo Jima. She then supported the Marines in the Battle of Iwo Jima from 19 February 9 March, when she sailed for Ulithi. During one part of that period, Enterprise kept aircraft aloft continuously over Iwo Jima for 174 hours. Okinawa. Departing Ulithi on 15 March, the carrier continued her night work in raids against Kyushu, Honshu, and shipping in the inland sea of Japan. Damaged lightly by an enemy bomb on 18 March, Enterprise entered Ulithi 6 days later for repairs. Back in action on 5 April, she supported the Okinawa operation until she was damaged on 11 April, this time by a kamikaze, and was forced back to Ulithi. Off Okinawa once more on 6 May, Enterprise flew patrols around the clock as kamikaze attacks increased. On 14 May 1945, she suffered her last wound of World War II when a kamikaze Zero piloted by Lieutenant J.G. Shunsuke Tomiyasu destroyed her forward elevator, killing 13 and wounding 68. The carrier sailed for and was fully repaired at the Puget Sound Navy Yard. Near ready, with all planes aboard at the degaussing/demagnetizing range off the Strait of Juan de Fuca when the Nagasaki bombing ended the war on 9 August 1945. Aviation Complement. The following aviation complement was disembarked from Enterprise on 7 September 1945 at NAS Barbers Point, United States Pacific Fleet Navy Carrier Air Group 52 CVG N-52 NYD Seattle Wunks Grumman F6F-5 Hellcat Ships Flight VF N-52 22x F6 F-5 plus 15x F6 F-5 P VT N-52 Torpedo Bomber Squadron 16th General Motors TVM-3E Avenger. Post-war Operation Magic Carpet. Restored to peak condition, Enterprise voyaged to Pearl Harbor, returning to the States with some 1141 servicemen due for discharge, including hospital patients and former POW, then sailed on to New York on 25 September 1945 via the Panama Canal, arriving on 17 October 1945. 2 weeks later, she proceeded to Boston for installation of additional berthing facilities, then began a series of 3 Operation Magic Carpet voyages to Europe, bringing home more than 10,000 veterans in her final service to her country. The first European voyage returned 4,668 servicemen from Southampton, England, in November 1945. On the second trip to Europe, she was boarded by the British First Lord of the Admiralty, Sir Albert Alexander, in Southampton, who presented Enterprise with a British Admiralty pennant that was hoisted when a majority of the Admiralty Board members were present. The pennant was given to Enterprise as a token of respect from several high-ranking officers of an ally. She returned to New York on 25 December 1945 with 4,413 servicemen. On this 9-day trip, she encountered 4 storms, some with winds of 80 miles per hour, 130 km/h that caused 75-foot 23 waves that swamped the forecastle deck in water up to 10 feet 3.0 in deep. According to Damage Control Officer John U. Monroe, the storms smashed sections of walkways and railings and swept loose objects overboard. Her last voyage was to the Azores and returned 3,557 personnel, including 212 WAC, to New York on 17 January 1946. The end for Enterprise. With the commissioning of over 24 larger and more advanced aircraft carriers by end of 1945, Enterprise was deemed surplus for the post-war needs of America's Navy. She entered the New York Naval Shipyard on 18 January 1946 for deactivation and was decommissioned on 17 February 1947. In 1946, she had been scheduled to be handed over to the state of New York as a permanent memorial, but this plan was suspended in 1949. Subsequent attempts were made at preserving the ship as a museum or memorial, but fundraising efforts failed to raise enough money to buy the vessel from the Navy, and Enterprise was sold on 1 July 1958 to the Lipset Corporation of New York City for scrapping at Kearny, New Jersey. A promise was made to save the distinctive tripod mast for inclusion in the Naval Academy's new football stadium, but was never fulfilled. Instead, a memorial plaque was installed at the base of what is still called Enterprise Tower. Scrapping was complete as of May 1960. In 1984, a permanent Enterprise exhibit was dedicated at the Naval Aviation Museum, Naval Air Station Pensacola, Florida, to house artifacts, photos, and other items of historical interest. Surviving Enterprise artifacts include the ship's bell, which resides at the U.S. Naval Academy, where it is traditionally rung only after midshipmen victories over West Point, and the 16-foot 4.9 one-ton nameplate from the ship's stern, which sits near a Little League Park in River Vale, New Jersey. Her commissioning plaque and one of her anchors are on display at the Washington Navy Yard in Washington, D.C. Successors to Enterprise. The name was revived in February 1958 when the world's first nuclear-powered aircraft carrier was laid down as the 8th Enterprise. This ship was commissioned in November 1961. Also nicknamed the Big E, various artifacts and mementos were kept aboard from her predecessor. The portholes in the captain's and port cabin and conference room are only one example. She was inactivated and removed from service on 1 December 2012 after being in the fleet for 51 years. Due to considerations arising from reactor removal, she cannot be turned into a memorial. At her inactivation, it was announced that the ninth ship to bear the name Enterprise would be the planned Gerald R. Ford-class aircraft carrier CV-80. It has not been confirmed what, if any, artifacts from USS Enterprise CV-6 will be incorporated into this next generation aircraft carrier, although a time capsule containing mementos from both CV-6 and CV-65 will be presented to the first captain of the new Enterprise. The aforementioned portholes aboard the CV-65 will be removed and returned to the Boston Navy Yard Museum. Awards and commendations. Enterprise was awarded a Presidential Unit Citation for her service during World War II. The citation states, "For consistently outstanding performance and distinguished achievement during repeated action against enemy Japanese forces in the Pacific War area, 7 December 1941 to 15 November 1942. Participating in nearly every major carrier engagement in the first year of the war, the Enterprise and her air group, exclusive of far-flung destruction of hostile shore installations throughout the battle area, did sink or damage on her own a total of 35 Japanese vessels and shot down a total of 185 Japanese aircraft. Her aggressive spirit and superb combat efficiency are fitting tribute to the officers and men who so gallantly established her as an ahead bulwark in the defense of the American nation." In addition to her Presidential Unit Citation, Enterprise received the Navy Unit Commendation and 20 battle stars for World War II service, making her the highest decorated U.S. ship of the war. Finally, she was presented with a British Admiralty pennant that was hoisted when a majority of the Admiralty board members were present. The pennant was given to Enterprise as an unofficial token of respect from an ally. In popular culture, Gene Roddenberry, creator of the television show Star Trek, named his fictional starship in honor of CV-6 early on in the development of the show because he was particularly fascinated by her war record and had always considered it a heroic ship. In doing so, he replaced the name SS Yorktown, named after Enterprise's sister ship he had originally envisioned for his fictional starship when he conceived the show in early 1964. Jack C. Taylor, founder of Enterprise Rent-A-Car, had served on Enterprise as a fighter pilot during the war and renamed his company in 1969 after the ship. Footnotes